Hello everyone, my name is Katherine Weare and I'm delighted to be the curator of this series of webcasts about contemplative education. There are actually 3 interrelated series, and this is the first talk of the second series, which is about implementation, making contemplative education work in practice. The first series was about theory and principles, and the final series will be about cutting edges and ways forward. In this series, you'll be hearing some real-life examples of the contemplative in mainstream education, from Finland, from Iceland, from Israel, from the UK, and examples from higher education. And the people who will be presenting for you are all members of our very vibrant community of contemplative education. And if you visit our website, you will see that we have 13 providers of 20 programs happening right across Europe. So the contemplative infiltrating education, which is my topic today, is a reality, not a theory. In this talk, I'm going to stand back from the detail and look at how we can infiltrate. What principles do we need to follow? And I hope this will be of interest to many of you who are friends of Mind and Life Europe. It will be sufficiently general for you to imagine that this might relate to your own work, not just in education, perhaps, in many different spheres. Well, the first thing we need to do is to be absolutely clear what it is that we're trying to infiltrate. And I firmly believe that the concept of mindfulness needs to be very core to contemplative education. So getting back to some first principles and looking at Jon Kabat-Zinn's kind of definition, it is essentially about paying attention to our present moment experience with some key attitudes of kindness, compassion and caring, and also open-minded curiosity. Some might call it non-judgmentalism. And it's a practice, it's not a theory, it's something that we learn to do. It's very much helped by formal meditation, but it really only comes to life when we start to actually live this out in our everyday life. So it's as much a practice off the cushion as it is on. Now you'll notice so far I haven't said the words calming and relaxation. Calming and relaxation are great, but they are very much byproducts of this process. And one of the problems we immediately hit in education is that folks have seized on the idea that all this is a calming and relaxing practice, a toolbox to make you feel better. And that if you just do these simple little techniques, your life will be transformed, you will be calm, your mind will clear. Now, this is not a good place to start. The point about the paying attention in a particular way is that it is a new way of relating to our experience. Difficult as well as pleasant experiences. And we know that if people come to mindfulness and contemplative education with the idea that it's all going to be lovely, there's 2 major problems emerge right at the outset. One is that they will rapidly become disillusioned because they will discover that meditation and mindfulness are not always pleasant. An interesting piece of work recently by a colleague of mine, Willem Kuyken, and his colleagues, showed that of teachers who were undertaking an 8-week course, 2/3 of them reported that the experience was often quite unpleasant. And what this is about is helping people to deal with the unpleasant, not to help them to feel permanently wonderful. And of course we take care of people, and if we believe this will be too much for them, we counsel them out of this. There are many people for whom mindfulness and contemplative approaches are not always indicated right now. But we do need to get expectations clear at the outset. This is not a panacea, this is not a magic bullet. It's challenging work, and this is why it absolutely has to begin with well-educated teachers who know what they're doing when they're teaching young people. We need to ask ourselves if the terrain is ready. Is the ground we're trying to till ready for this? We did an interesting little piece of research across the experts of Europe on what they felt was helping mindfulness and contemplative approaches in their country. And we discovered that these were going best in countries where two things were present. One was that the education system was ready. There was a clear understanding that people are wholes, not parts, who have minds, bodies, spirits, and who need to learn in many different active ways. Schools that understand the importance of well-being and mental health, for example. So this groundwork needed to be there, and it's no surprise that mindfulness and contemplative approaches do best in situations where there is already work around teacher development, social and emotional learning, and the development of the inner person. It also depended on the state of mindfulness in the adult population, whether courses like MBSR were already there and present. So you can't hope to go any faster in education than you can in the surrounding context. And there is really no point in starting off if the ground's not ready. You'd do better to try to prepare the ground in other more general ways. The next question might be, what persuades people? What persuades the stakeholders, the people with the money and the purse strings and the ability to provide resources? What persuades the grassroots to take this on? Well, evidence, yes. We do need to have a really clear grasp of the outcomes of these approaches, the hard evidence. The neuroscience always goes down well, particularly with educators' work on which parts of the brain seem to be influenced by mindfulness meditation is always a fascination. But it's also very important that we gather testimony and stories, because people are most persuaded by hearing that people like them are getting something from this practice. And it leads me to reflect on the importance of using a top-down and a bottom-up approach. We need to persuade the leaders, the movers, the shakers, the politicians, the head teachers, the policymakers to encourage mindfulness in education. But we do this best by involving them in the practice, by starting with them and their needs, with their stresses, with their sense of overwhelm. Because if they are persuaded that it works in their own lives, they are much more likely to be passionate about these approaches for other people. And in fact, there's nothing worse than people in control who tell you that you need to do something for your own good, but they're not doing it for themselves. So we start with the well-being and the mindfulness of the leaders themselves. And we also need to understand the needs of those who are going to be applying this, particularly in education, to the teachers and the lecturers. And to really get it that these are mostly very stressed out people who are overwhelmed very often by their tasks, who are already dealing with overpacked curricula, and who can't be doing with hearing that this is something that they have to add in. It needs to be something they can immediately see will help them to make their lives easier and more effective. And so we need to be looking at the evidence on improving the practice of teachers themselves. Fortunately, that evidence is there, and I outline it in my next talk. So what sustains it? If you persuade people and you get it through the door, you have the right model on the go, what sustains it? Well, very much dealing with the situation in which you find yourself and embedding it in the context of education, not the context of the contemplative necessarily. The word contemplative doesn't mean very much to many educators. It smacks of monasticism, for which they really don't understand, nor does necessarily talking about mindfulness-based interventions and therapy. It comes from a different world to education. Education is about learning predominantly, and educators talk the language of skills and knowledge and that kind of transformation, not necessarily talking about therapy or contemplative approaches. And we need to look very much at what are the priorities of people who work in educational contexts, which predominantly are improving what they think of as learning. And I'll say more on that in the next one. And if we get that right, if we get the link between the contemplative and learning established, then further links around well-being and mental health and so on are more likely to take place. How do we best then introduce this to students? Well, it very much starts with well-educated teachers. I'm passionate about this. Teachers have to embody the contemplative and the values that go with it. Colleagues of mine who work in schools have endless quotations from the young people themselves along the lines of, "We know which ones of you practice and which ones don't, you know." Because it's very obvious to students whether their teachers are practicing what they preach, whether they have the values of kindness and caring, whether they're open-minded, whether they themselves are becoming more patient and tolerant and more able to deal with the difficult. It's absolutely apparent whether their teachers are seriously into this approach or whether they're just reading it from the book. So we need to start with the well-educated teachers. And we need to, of course, get across to those in education who are in command of the curriculum that this is not a knowledge-based curricular subject. It's about developing the skills of the inner person. Now, that's not an unfamiliar idea in education. Often analogies with sport may be quite helpful, for example. Teachers know well that there's more to education than knowledge, but we do need to really work up what it is that we are trying to teach young people. And I say more about that in my next talk, but very much about self-regulation, metacognition, paying attention. There are some core skills here that permeate the entire school. We can't teach these approaches in cold, hard environments. It's based on relationships. This is, as I say, hard work, and it can involve people opening up and trusting their teacher. So the atmosphere in which we teach young people has to be kind, open, invitational, and warm. What they're learning about has to be relevant to their needs. We need to make sure that it embeds itself in the real everyday life of young people, and that they learn it in ways which are conducive to them, not to us. So, for example, needs to be fun, lively, exciting, practical. And sometimes learning mindfulness in the world of adult mindfulness approaches is not all that relevant to how we best teach it to young people. They need to see it being embedded across the rest of the school and to believe that this matters and not to have it just as a discrete lesson which has no further relevance across the whole school. So again, we're back to teacher development, whole school development, and I'll be saying more about that in my next talk, and you will be hearing some lovely whole school examples during this series. And I think my final piece of advice to you there, as folks who would like to develop this in education, is to embody it yourself. You need to be a mindful innovator. We need to listen. We need to learn about the context we're working in. We need patience. We need to be in no hurry. You can't push this along. It's not that kind of development at all. Much more like cultivating a garden than it is making a machine work or spreading out some kind of product across the community. It has to be real, it has to be genuine, and it has to be done in a way that is commensurate and congruent with what it is we're trying to develop. So, to sum up what I've attempted to say, if we want to develop mindfulness and contemplative approaches in educational settings, we need, first of all, to spread a really clear understanding that this is about relating to our experience, including the difficult, in new ways, and that in itself is not always going to be a walk in the park. We need to go where the ground is right, not waste time trying to till stony soil, go where people are ready. We need a combination of top-down and bottom-up approaches, and in both cases to meet the felt needs of the managers, the policymakers, and the people on the ground, and to start where they are and to meet their own everyday challenges. When we're teaching it to students, we need to make sure the relationship is there, the context is there, that it's fun, that it's engaging. And most of all, that the people who are teaching it practice what they preach and embody the very attitudes and values that they think need to be rolled out across the school or the university. And finally, all of us to notice that it just takes time. We all need to calm down some of our enthusiasms perhaps and just let the process do the work. Thank you for your attention. I hope some of this engaged with some of the things that are on your minds, and I hope that you find the time to look at some of the later presentations. Thank you very much.